Although this is a bit delayed, I would like to. I don't want to talk about Super Tuesday so much. As just it made me think of a few things. I think it's evident the way the voting has come that Ron Paul has a ceiling, and that ceiling can be defined as a proportion of the electorate generally, of the population as a whole, and within the Republican Party. And it's it's definitely to the point now where he can legitimately claim to get at least 15%. I know has gotten less than that in a few of these straw polls, but I think it's really his ceiling is somewhere probably more around 20, 25, and within the Republican establishment. Which is not to say in a matchup with somebody that he'd only get 25%, because then in a matchup against another person, I mean, you're talking about how people view the two, not just him. But I think that there's probably 75, 80% of the population who, or at least of the Republican Party, who really are not going to vote for Ron Paul unless he's the only alternative. I think a lot of those people would vote for Ron Paul if he was running against Obama, but given the choice between the four that are running, Gingrich, Santorum, and Romney, they would pick either of those three over Ron Paul most of the time. I think you're talking at least 70, 80% of the Republican electorate. And it's been noted that he always wins among the young. That there's really, his ceiling isn't a proportion of some poll or some electorate, it's based on age, mostly. Which is not to say that there aren't young people who don't support him. I've got on my Facebook, I've got lots of people my age who hate his guts, who either really support one of his particular candidates, although there's not many of those. There's a few who are real partisan for one or the other, although usually that's a function of them having worked for them before, or who have a kind of right-wing ideology that they can't stand Ron Paul and they support anybody over him. And then there, of course, there are older people who like Ron Paul as well, but the polls are pretty clear. I think the anecdotal evidence is pretty clear that above 30, and especially like above 40, the incidence of Paul favorability declines enormously. I think that's really interesting. I think there's probably a couple reasons we can attribute that to. And one is how people get their information. One thing that really struck me a couple of years ago, I think I was still in college. I went to visit my uncle, and my uncle is an extremely intelligent man. He's extremely well read. He has literally thousands of books. He's read most of them. And my history buffness is definitely akin to his. And I remember, and he's very much, it's kind of odd because he really is very knowledgeable about the Constitution, and he really has a very, very strong minarchist, objectivist. He has a lot of Ayn Rand that he's into kind of view of the world. But it's much more principled and thorough than your average Republican. And yet he is a huge, essentially neocon. He is very much a hawk. I don't know if that's because he was in the army or not. That's probably part of it, or because he grew up in the baby boomer generation where everybody lauded World War II. But I think one of the main reasons is how he gets his information. Because one day I went to visit him and we were talking, and we always have very, very interesting discussions. We can go for literally 7 or 8 hours at a sitting and basically have to stop because our lives have to go on. But he started to talk about Thomas Sowell, and he goes, "Oh, have you ever heard of Thomas Sowell?" And I said, "Oh, of course I've heard of Thomas Sowell. In fact, I just watched a Liberty Pen, I think it was a Liberty Pen clip of his. They're putting out clips of his all the time, and I'd say a couple years before this, I had come across it. Once I've come across somebody once or twice and I find them interesting, I'll usually do the whole rundown of look them up on Wikipedia, type their name into YouTube, watch any lectures they have, listen to any radio. I mean, I'll get the rundown pretty quick, and then I'll have an ear to that person from then on. And I had done that to Thomas Sowell not long before this, maybe 6 or 7 months before this. But I haven't read any of his books, but I've heard him give speeches. I've heard summaries of his books. Anyway, so my uncle says, well, Thomas Sowell is great. And he goes, let me see, I think I have something. And he went and he had a big stack of old, they looked like newspapers, but they were actually some type of magazine, probably a monthly magazine put out by some conservative organization. Probably only has a couple thousand circulation. And they were old. They were from like the early 90s, like 93, 94. And sure enough, buried in one of them, there was a Thomas Sowell article. And I almost was taken aback. Like, yeah, I'm sure that article's great, but I mean, I've listened to hours of lectures from and interviews of Thomas Sowell, radio interviews, and I've seen him give speeches, and from before this, from during that time, from after that time, and I've sampled from such a wealth of information about him and this one particular topic that one article is of negligible significance relative to all that. That's what I was thinking. I didn't want to insult him and say that. And the thing is, he has a computer, but he does not surf the web. He doesn't look for information. He doesn't have an email. He doesn't have Facebook. He doesn't have YouTube. He doesn't, which I mean, you don't have to have those things, but he doesn't get his information from the internet. He gets his information from the news, especially Fox News, a series of periodicals, like, say, National Review, and books, which there's nothing wrong with that, and the radio. He listens to the radio in the car, and he listens to Rush Limbaugh, although I don't think he is one of those people who idolizes him. That's where he gets his news. And what this has a couple of really important consequences. On a basic level, we all know that there's a bias in the media. If you watch Rush Limbaugh on Fox News and Carl and what's his name, Mark Levin, you're not going to get a very objective view of somebody like Ron Paul. But even just accepting that the information they give is worth something, that they are actually giving out some information, they give out very, very little, and it's like you have to passively kind of wait for it. And this is how TV is in general. This is why I'm so frustrated with things like the History Channel. I love history, but why watch the History Channel? Forgetting for now that most of their shows are about Nazis, aliens, and doomsday cults. You just have to sit there and hope that something comes your way. But if you're interested in, I mean, if I'm interested in, like just a few days ago, I got really interested in pre-Harappan societies. Well, God, you know how long I'd have to watch the History Channel before that ever came up? Probably never. It would never happen. But I can go on the internet and check out read the Wikipedia page, then follow the links, then do a general search, read some of the documents, look if there's any books, blah, 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 blah. If some of them really pique my interest, maybe I'll buy them. And boom, I can, and just in an afternoon, and God, every day I'll do that on different topics, probably at least 5 or 6 times. And then I'm always reading a book too. So it's not, people like to accuse the internet where, well, you're just being flippant about it. And it's true if that's the only way you go about getting your information. Very few sources on the internet are going to be really, really super comprehensive in a long way, like a book. There are websites that have that amount of text, but I've never been able to read that much on the screen. Most people who get their information from the internet won't do that. But it's a great reference. I mean, there's no reference even close to that. And so there's a bias because he's getting all of his news from Fox News and Glenn Beck. He does love Glenn Beck. He's kind of all over the map when it comes to liberty and Ron Paul and that sort of thing. But then the other thing is just kind of the degree to which if you use the internet, you can verify things, or at least see if there's a counter. See if there's any counter argument. If you watch the news and they say, I mean, unfortunately I was watching a little bit of CNN the other day, and they were talking about this Coney thing, and the bimbo reporter was like, well, they were kind of debating whether we should send troops to Uganda, but it wasn't whether it's okay for us to send troops or not so much as she actually said it like this: how do we decide which countries to help? We can't help them all, so maybe we should, instead of helping Uganda, we should send them to, DRC or CAR, Central African Republic. And what's weird about that is, so she just framed the whole argument as, well, whatever we do, we're helping them, without considering, oh, maybe we're not helping them. But see, you can find that counter opinion on the internet very easily. And, I've made a couple anti-Kony videos, but actually a number of people have, and a number of websites. I've been, just from using social media, things that my friends have found from Lou Rockwell, but from other sites, from The Guardian, from newspapers in Europe, about, oh, well, this Kony 2012 thing is pretty bullshit. And so right from the start, this Kony thing happens, and that within a day, I've already read counterpoints. And my understanding of the event is much more binocular than the monism you get from just watching the TV or just listening to the radio. Even if you have a very critical mind, you are just fed, it's looking through the world through a tiny little straw. And so with the older generation, that's how they get their information. All these great, web media documents about how great Ron Paul is, and all these debates, these really thought-provoking debates about the pros and cons of his position and of his politics and of his candidacy and all that. It's not to be found in the primary medium that people over a certain age use, either because they're completely biased or because the media is restricted in how much information it can give out at a certain time. And actually, obviously, it's both of those. And so they are insulated, basically, from reality through the lens of a media that is both corrupt and biased, and also severely limited. And this limits to a much. And look, we're all limited. Just because I watch the internet doesn't mean that I have unlimited. But it has, it's broader. There's more to it than there is if you're just getting it from the TV. So I think that's probably the biggest single factor that's changing, why one demographic is so for him and one demographic is so against him. But there are other reasons. One is the culture. These baby boomers and above very much are in the shadow of World War II. I feel like I'm in the shadow of World War II, but I was far removed from it. And people my age and younger are far removed from it compared to, to us, a World War II veteran is a grandparent. It's an older person, a very old person now. There's World War II vets now are at least in their late 80s. But for the generations older, they are your parents, maybe even your older brothers or older relatives. And that was a period of exceptional conformity to government. And that's what they harken back. Everybody harkens back to their youth, and wants to have a nostalgia for their youth. And so that's what all these old people are. And so there's that. And the other thing I think is a kind of quasi self-interest where if they get to that age where they're going to start requiring Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, it becomes very difficult for them to really principally question the programs of the state. And to such a degree that somebody like Ron Paul has to be seen as threatening, even though he's very explicit that not only would it be basically politically impossible for him to say abolish those programs, he's not going to try because his priorities are different than that. Even though, to his credit, he admits, yes, they're unconstitutional, and not just to be dogmatic, they don't work. They're bad programs. That is true. That when you see, humans are risk averse, and if you have like a life savings, you have to be very sensitive about that. And so, for like me, if I have a huge stash of gold and silver, and that represents all of my life savings or a huge portion of it, or I think I'm going to be counting on that, if somebody comes and says, I think that it's bad that you have all that gold and silver, and you shouldn't have all that gold and silver, but I promise I won't take it, uh, that is very not reassuring to me. And even if I trusted that person, I would be very uneasy about it. Uh, there, these social programs, the government explicitly uses them as a club to intimidate people. Hey, you better do what we say and pay us, and don't complain too much. This anti-tax demonstrations aren't good because you're going to need these taxes for our things, but they don't even have to do it because people realize that their future is basically in the government's hands to such an extent that they don't want to risk losing it. Now, I personally believe that if Ron Paul is actually able to politically bring about what he wants, which I don't think he could ever do, even if he were to become president, I don't think it would be that bad. There are good things the government could do to divest itself. One I've always thought of, and one I actually saw Walter Williams speak about, is they could just start giving land to people and say, okay, you aren't going to get Social Security. Here's 500 acres of land out west, which most people will not live on or build a business on, although they'd certainly have the right to do that. They will sell, and they'll be able to or rent and use the proceeds for whatever. And that would actually be really good because then you'd be getting people off the dole, you'd be reducing the need to tax and cutting spending, and you'd be freeing up lands for productive use away from the government, which is a huge, huge issue that is just not talked about very much, although I've heard that Utah is going to start trying to take back some of its lands. I don't like the idea that Utah would have the lands. Presumably Utah will take the lands and divest the lands to the hands of Utahians, good Mormons, and I'm sure the Mormons will put it to good use far better than the federal government ever will. I just think that if we had Ron Paul, the price of healthcare would shoot down, and we wouldn't be worrying about what am I going to do when I'm old. You'd be able to work just a couple hours a week and be able to pay for all of your expenses and whatever. Unless I verge into free market utopianism here, that's my view on it. But most people don't view it that way, and it's just scary talk to them to have this guy bashing an organization that they pretty much realize has them by the balls. And so they can't identify with it that much. And of course, then there's also the whole, once you get to a certain point, it becomes hard to change your ideology. Of course, that's true with everybody. There's a certain inertia to ideology. And the longer it sits, the more there is, I think. And we're all guilty of this to some extent, myself included. But if you're 50 or 60, I think it's going to be a bigger issue, although not an insoluble one, than it is if you're in there. The other thing is the weight of the economic downturn, I think, is falling more on the young and the poor than it is on the older generation. The older generation took a hit that might have been bigger in nominal terms, but is far less foreboding than the young people. Because I just got out of college just before the crash, and even though I was kind of a little bit I didn't think the crash was going to happen right then or anything, but I thought that the Fed was inflating money, and I had started to buy gold and silver, actually just silver at that point, prior to that. And when the collapse came, I didn't lose any money. The price of silver basically doubled in that period. I did well, but you just get out of college and you're like, I want to go and get a job. I want to go and start having my life, and you can't get a job, or it's hard to get a good job, and your prospects that, like our parents basically looked at it like, you go to college, or maybe even you don't go to college, and you just get a well-paying job, and that's going to be everything you could possibly need, and you'll just have that forever. And they were contented with that, and they probably looked at the system that existed then and said, "Hey, well, that system is what gave us that," when that's not true, actually. And so we might as well keep going with that system. And a lot of those people probably say, "Oh, well, things changed because of Bush," but it wasn't Bush something. So if you're young and you basically see your opportunities being squandered, and then you're saying, "Okay, I have all these enormous taxes, and I'm supposedly paying them because I'll someday get Social Security," although all they ever talk about now is how there isn't enough and blah, blah, blah. Why would we have any reason to hope that that would be there in 40 years or whatever when we were going to want it? So there is definitely, that's, I think, another huge incentive thing where, from the young person's point of view, the possibility that the state's going to come through in the end is much more remote than somebody who thinks, look, all I got to do is, yeah, maybe it won't work 50 more years, I'll be dead in 20, so it doesn't matter. Or I've put into it this long. That's the other thing. I've not paid very much in terms of Social Security in my life, just because I haven't earned very much and I haven't been around that long. If I had spent $150,000 towards it, I'd probably have a different view of how much I wanted it back. Whereas right now, I'm very easy to say I should just write that off, and I kind of do. I'm never going to get that money, or if I do, it won't be worth anything. But then, and this kind of ties it together, the only reason I know that, though, is because I've learned a lot about economics, and I've learned a lot about history, and that's something that would just not have been very practical. It wouldn't have been impossible, but not very practical if I had started on my intellectual journey in, say, the 60s or 70s. People did become very intelligent and knowledgeable, but it was very difficult. I've listened to people like that, and even using books. I read tons of books, but where do I buy them all? On Amazon. That's where I find any book I want, I can find, and it's only a question of price, and that's rarely a question because usually the books are so cheap that it's how many dozen do I want to buy today? Right now I have the problem where I buy more than I can read. But in the past, you could go to a bookstore, they'd have a very limited selection. You could, and then what? And there's a really smart, I don't know if he still does it, guy named Stanley Monteith who had a radio show, very conspiratorial, but he was a highly, very well-read guy, and if you ever listened to his show, which I only did about once, I think, he was always citing books, like, oh, you should read this book and that book, and you'd have to sit there and write down all the books, and I would do that, and I would buy them, and they were all great books, but, he talks about how all through the 50s and 60s, he would basically go on national tours, just like in his car. He would drive around, and he'd stop at like antique stores and old bookstores, and he would literally go through the whole thing looking for books. And he might go to 5 stores and not find anything worth reading, and then he might find 1 or 2 gems. And he did that his whole life for decades. And now, and then he kind of compresses all that driving around and looking and says, book A, B, C, and D, and then I just go on Amazon and buy them, and they're at my doorstep within a couple days. I don't think I ever could have gotten to where I am ideologically if I had been in his position, or the position of our parents when they were coming about. And then you just develop a habit, and when the internet becomes suddenly available to you, they're less likely to grab onto it. Some of them do. Some of them use it to a certain extent. Yes. It's not like they're all cretins and dullards who can't use it. That's not true. They just aren't used to accumulating knowledge that way. They're used to Walter Cronkite telling them and his successors what to think about things and what's acceptable politically. So there's a Ron Paul ceiling, but I think the other kind of hopeful thing about all is obviously if Ron Paul's constituency are young people and people who use the internet, what's going to happen to the size of his constituency? it's going to grow. It has to grow, and it has. Maybe that's one of the main reasons he's bigger now than 4 years ago. Is there's literally been that much growth, and everybody has kind of said that it's doubled basically. If only it could double every 4 years, then we'd be in. I mean, I don't think that's going to happen, but I mean, our problems would be solved in a decade or two. So there is hope that his message, the libertarian message, influence is going to grow. Maybe even someday become predominant. Although I don't think that's a requirement. In terms of this election, Ron Paul will never get a majority. However, which is a huge handicap for him. There's no question that's a hurdle that he is unlikely able to jump. However, it does look like there's a good chance there will be a brokered convention when that happens. I think anything is possible, although I think that the odds that he would come out of that with the nomination or even the vice presidency are very, very slim, although not negligible. It certainly will be very interesting, and I am eager to see what will happen. However, I think the other point here is that clearly the possible political victory that he says he wants and that he's hoping to get, and I don't think he's being pie in the sky for saying that, is an ancillary segment or part of his revolution. His main revolution is an ideological one, and all we can say is that there have been enormous gains in that area. How far is hard to say. How to qualify or quantify it is difficult at this point, but clearly it's grown by a lot. I think you could have said for years it was growing kind of at a trickle, at a very low linear increase, and I don't know if it's arithmetic, geometric, or exponential, but something happened where or maybe just the linear line changed its angle to be more steep. I don't know, but or maybe such convenient mathematical models are inappropriate for a change in ideology. They probably are, but clearly it has grown. So that's good. The older generation, aside from the fact that they're going to die, are being overpopulated by the younger generation that is keyed into the internet, that does have a different method, a broader method for learning things, which is a two-way street. That doesn't mean everyone who uses the internet is a libertarian. That means a lot of them end up becoming socialist or whatever. But the battle of ideas is fought on fair terms, and I think that means libertarianism has a fair hand, which is way better than the biased hand that's been dealt against it for so long, that it's going to do a lot better in the future. So that's what I think.